Welcome, everyone, to a new edition of Talking with Poets. Delighted today to speak with a poet and eminent translator from Ukraine, of Ukrainian origin,
Yeah,
Dzvinia
my first
Orlowsky.
generation.
Go ahead.
First generation.
First generation migrant, right? Um, and so tell me first, yes, about the migration. Who came over to this country? Your parents or your grandparents, and where did they settle? And because I think
Yes,
that has to do with some of the roots of this book as well. Go ahead.
yes, and the cover as well too,
Yeah.
right in our back.
Here's the book, by the way. Those
Yes,
absences now
and that's
closest.
me, the second one over in the blue dress,
Oh my, in the
picture
blue
taken
dress.
by my father. But first of all,
Wonderful.
Andrew, I wanted to say thank you so much for having me here
Sure,
to
sure.
converse with you. I love your series. You've interviewed two of my favorite people, writers, Joanna Solfrian and Jeff Friedman. So I'm delighted to be here as part of the series. So to answer your question, my maternal grandmother and my mother and father came from Ukraine. They fled Ukraine in the 50s, and they through Austria, and they arrived in New York City where my father was doing a medical internship. And then they decided that they wanted to go to someplace that was as close to Ukraine in terms of feel.
Mm,
So they migrated further to Ohio and bought a small home that had 10 acres of meadow, which my mother filled with 7 dogs, a horse, 3 cats.
right, right.
And they settled to find their childhood there and connect up with other Ukrainians who had come over as well. And that was usually through say, church and piano lessons,
Okay, okay.
piano concerts, which
Theater
we do.
concerts. Okay. Do you play the piano to this day, or?
I avoid it to this day because I was traumatized
Okay,
by
okay.
this Hungarian Rhapsody. I did not feel his Rhapsody, and I couldn't find the ending at stage. So
All right, all
uh,
right.
no, but I love the piano. Um, and basically, I grew up speaking Ukrainian. That was
Sure.
my first language, and my sister and I were not allowed to speak English at home, and we socialized only with Ukrainian kids. So I had a very sort of isolated childhood, which I don't regret because I loved our meadow. I loved all our animals, and I think I found my muse there because I was so introverted that I channeled everything
Right.
into
Right.
heavy diary writing,
Uh,
and
like
and
a
I'm very
like the
grateful for the
painting.
beauty.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I was going to say
No,
Zvinia's
no, go
world,
ahead.
Zvinia's world, like Christina's world. I mean that
Thank you.
that.
Yeah, for Andrew Wyeth, yes.
Right, right, right. You were
So,
born in Ohio then.
and yes, in Cambridge, no, Cambridge, Ohio. And then
Okay,
I moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts.
right. Oh, well, that's interesting as well. Tell me, um, why why the title? I'll get right to the heart of those absences now closest. It's a beautiful,
Um,
haunting title, but I want to
oh,
ask you
oh,
something about it.
thank you so much. That means a lot for me to hear you say that.
Mm,
Um, I, a lot of these poems were written before Russia's attack on Ukraine.
right, right,
But when that occurred, I mean, I was raised with a great sense of loss in our home. My grandmother forever mourned her son who was a partisan, was captured and was in Siberia. So she was always saying the rosary, always sad. My father played a silver tone guitar, but he played minor keys constantly. So it was minor keys, minor keys, minor keys. So I like to say I was raised in a minor key. And
mm,
my grandmother used to hold me and always referred to me as her poor orphan.
mm,
So that was sort of the Slavic sensibility.
right, right,
So those absences were always there for me. Even though I didn't understand them, I felt them. But once I saw the bombings, and once, I mean, we always knew that Ukraine, to some degree, was considered borderless, and anybody could come in anytime,
mm,
you know. But the violence of this attack just bumped everything up, and those what I was witnessing as not an actual witness in Ukraine, it became so poignant to me as well as to, to most people. And that continues, Gaza, whatever wars, understatement, horrible experience. But it was like those things that I pulled even closest.
Now, when you were watching the bombing of and the killing in Ukraine by the Russians coming in, invading, um, you were brought back. Were you also brought back to to the departure of your parents and the grandmother in the 50s? Were they were fleeing um, a
Yes,
Soviet
and
Union essentially?
German as well, both. But so your question is, did it bring me back to?
I mean, were you sort of having what's it called, a kind of trauma, delayed trauma or something, or revisiting the trauma of your parents and an earlier generations through this current
I
progression?
I don't know that I was revisiting their trauma, but I understood and I started to question things more deeply because growing up, my parents wanted, as I mentioned, to reclaim almost a childhood, and we were in touch with relatives, but they did not want to bring that into the home. My grandmother already brought it up tenfold, and my father did not want us speaking English, which became tricky. First, when we went to school, um, but it was, you hear these things and you'd seen them happen on the news, but never this huge scale, which this was just abject annihilation.
Right.
And so um, that was very traumatic in terms of what, how do I even, how do I respond? How does anybody respond to something like that? And thank goodness, um, through a higher power, I had already embarked on doing translation during quarantine. And I remember to a prominent newspaper when the first translation came out
Mm.
saying, would you be interested in reviewing this? And the editor very kindly said, we don't really do, poetry's always a risk. Ukraine? And he said, if Ukraine does anything in the next year worthy of international attention,
Mm.
we're on. And then when they attacked, I said, I hope you're reading your own paper. Is this, so it went, I think what was really unique was to go from an upbringing where people were saying, what is Ukrainian? Oh, I translated Ukrainian. Some Ukrainian undergrad, oh, you mean Russian? It was always, oh, you mean Russian? And all of a sudden to come from this place where I felt I was speaking a language that nobody really spoke, because my
Right.
Ukrainian is different than the Russified Ukrainian. So it was just also, I it was the feeling of annihilation, and that definitely took it another.
Did that paper finally do the republish the review, or
Yes,
yes. What
they
was the paper? I'm just curious. I'll look it up.
oh the Washington Post.
Washington Post. Very good.
Yes.
To me, I love this book, and I moved. The particular, for me, I really was seized by these poems in part three, where you go to that idyllic landscape where your parents moved, and the poems like Pitchfork, Ohio, 1978, or In the Burning, or If We Weren't Knocking on Wood. I would like to know if you'd like to begin by reading some of these poems, for the listeners to have an idea what's in those
Uh,
absences now closest, or if you had some others that you'd like to begin with.
I had some others planned, but if you'd like me to
No, no, no. Let's
read
hear
any.
what you'd like, and now we can come back to these um, as
Okay,
we're speaking. Yeah.
all right. Well, one of the things that fascinated me when I was translating was I read I grew up knowing Ukrainian is very sort of folkloric and
Yeah.
beautiful tales, and it's known as the language of the nightingale because it's so sonoric and it's so lovely. But then when I was translating the first collection by Natalka Bilo-Surkiewicz, she had a poem there called The Bridge, and a line that said, "The nightingales must be drinking their own black alcohol." And that really struck me. And I mentioned it to Ali Kinsella, my co-translator, and she said, "Well, Dzvinia, it was a form of censorship. Basically, you have this beautiful and was encouraged lyrical language. Stay with your songs, stay with your folk tales, but the language is not coming into academia, it's not coming into politics, you know." So it was a language that we thought, oh, how beautiful, how wonderful, but it was really, the language is being marginalized. So
Marginalized.
anyway, some of these are response poems to that. And this one is called Nightingales. Slipped into silence, neither their once highly regarded melancholic songs, nor tattered bags filled with brown feathers could be swapped back for once upon a time wisdom. Lacking purpose and star quality, no one cared anymore if, trapped in cages, they could sing single sonorous notes, or if scorched at dawn, be served on toast. Who is crying now? Who is beating the horse? Worrying too much, they turned into flycatchers.
Yeah. Tell us about that. Worrying too much, they turned into flycatchers. The nightingales turned into flycatchers. What was going on in your mind as you?
In my mind, it was that they were losing, I was imagining losing their charm,
Yeah.
losing their magic. And without that kind of deliberate association with only specific things, they lost their larger identity and became merely flycatchers and started worrying about things.
Mm. It makes me think: is the poet, the nightingale, facing the reality of this Armageddon? This terrible, unceasing destruction. What is this a book, among others, of rescue, or somehow of affirming what the poet or a poetry can do, at least in conserving the song, conserving some memories, recreating the life, somehow this life, this paradise that we're trying to recreate in America, in this case, of the lost paradise of Ukraine. I don't know, can you just reflect about your sense of the poet's role, your own role as a poet in writing these poems, um, your social role, your political role?
Yes, that's a very large question, and I
Mhm.
think that even after having written the book, it's a question that I've started answering back in with my first book, A Handful of Bees, when I bravely put down Ukrainian American because I was always told that I'm Ukrainian, even though I'm American born. That's what my parents insisted. But I think for me in this book, I also wanted to acknowledge the other Ukrainian voices that made an impact on me. And I felt the urgency as part of the Russia's annihilation of Ukrainian voices to not only actively get as busy translating books, and we've been doing one after the other, but also to show how I reflect on it as a first generation non-direct witness. So for example, I have in the back in the USSR in that third section
Yeah,
where I basically
Orlowsky
say
book.
that, oh, the Ukraine girls knock us out. Fantastic. What more does anybody need? It was that coming of age and not necessarily understanding what was going on and paying attention, but that Ukrainian backdrop was always there. It's the same thing with like in that poem Pitchfork, Ohio. I've written a number of poems that have to do with my father's passing from cancer and the malpractice suit that was never realized because it was stalled. And I remember at that moment getting so angry at the lawyers that I pulled the pitchfork out of our garage/barn and told them to get off our property, which was a very defiant act. Then receiving this letter, which said the deposition had gone through, but you know, they'll never forget that side of me. I mean, it was patronizing because
Right,
they were
right. The deposition
confident.
went through, meaning there was some kind of money paid for, I mean,
Yes,
some kind of
yes,
compensation.
a minimum amount. But I
Hmm.
remember that moment when my father had to be off of morphine. They came to our home to do the deposition. He was off of morphine, so he was in the end stages of his illness, and he was in a great deal of pain. And they were trying to prove that he was incompetent, so that the deposition didn't go through. And my father was a doctor, so he kept, copious notes, but he clearly was having some, foggy issues. But then when they started saying, "Oh, you went to school here. Is that Poland? Is that Ukraine?" It's here in this moment in the safety of Ohio. Those questions were constantly being asked and constantly being answered.
Right.
Sometimes it was Poland, sometimes it was Ukraine, sometimes it was Russian. So I feel like I wanted a section to speak like a direct, I'm witnessing what people are directly witnessing. There are some kind of ekphrastic poems based off of paintings, um, but those flecks always come in my writing. And you had also mentioned the poem "If We Weren't Knocking on Wood," which is, I grew up in a very superstitious family. I mean, I think maybe that was culturally apt, and we were always appropriating luck to these gestures and rituals and symbols. And I like to think back to that and say, how does that help somebody in a trauma situation where they do feel like they have some control when everything else is out of control?
Just
So, yes,
just a question quickly about the lawyers. So the lawyers were for the other side. They were coming together to try and prove that the lawsuit was not
to be dropped. Yeah.
right, right, right. That's why the pitchfork. Yeah, that's a very dark poem. Again, it brings me back to that image I have of Andrew Wyatt and that
Yes.
the American Gothic. I forget who made that film. Was it a David Lynch? I can't remember. But anyway, tell me about uh, another aspect of this. I love the idea of rescuing the culture and this need. I mean, the translator is a without the translator we are. I mean, the translator is a guardian, is a keeper, is a preserver, is a conserver, making work available through the bridge of into English in this case, uh, what people would simply not know about. And so you're doing a great service.
Thank you.
But also, tell me about how your own writing exists in both the American poetic tradition and in the Ukrainian poetry tradition, because and the forms you write in. I mean, you're writing in free verse, but you're obviously you have a musical language. Tell me about the sort of choices you make stylistically when you set out to write a poem. And do you see yourself as a migrant, though, but yeah, I mean, a first generation, but yet somehow participating in two traditions? I mean, both the traditions of American poetry and then the tradition of the Ukraine, from where your roots are.
Mhm. And I'm sorry, which
I mean, do you see yourself, your work? I mean, has
mhm.
your work been translated back into Ukrainian, for example?
By in the Talkabila Serkiv, it's translated a number of poems, and then I had a few poems translated more recently. Not a collection, but that exchange, particularly when I was translating the Talka, she was kind enough to translate 5 or 6 poems.
And what kind of feeling do you have when you see those poems or hear those poems out loud?
I'm moved to tears. I am moved to tears. I was raised fluent, but my Ukrainian had very strong Polish. influences, because Western Ukraine was, working it out with Poland back then. Um, so a lot of the Ukrainian that I hear now has to some extent been Russified. So it was, I'm blessed to work with Ali Kinsella, who is not a native Ukrainian, but she's done Peace Corps work for a number of years, and her Ukrainian is outstanding. And I feel like I've been revisiting that. So to hear or see my poem in that language, just it brings me back to the simple thought of, my parents would be so proud.
Right, right, wonderful.
The one who said that she didn't want to go to Ukrainian school because she wanted to watch Beatle cartoons, ended up doing something that contributed.
No, I ask also a bit out of self-interest because I'm a poet from Tamil from Ceylon, a country that no longer exists, now known as Sri Lanka. I'm American, and I write in English, and I write also in other languages, in French and Spanish and Portuguese,
Yes,
Haitian Creole. But I don't write in Tamil. I don't speak Tamil anymore. So I recently someone suggested translating my poems into Tamil, and I don't know how that project will go, but I'm thinking about uh, circling the circle or something, or filling the fracture itself up,
yes.
and I'm wondering how whether that experience of seeing your work in Ukrainian helped heal some of the absences, or if that's one of the absences.
I love how you say, the sort of complete the fracture itself, because it's always been that sense, that hyphen between Ukrainian and American at times just seems like this miles long bridge,
Mm.
and growing up, it was like you were neither really one nor you weren't really the other. But also just in terms of seeing my my words in Ukrainian, and a line that for me was this long appears this long, vice versa. And I'm reading it and I'm thinking, okay, they saw this image as this. It made me even more sensitive to that sense of always having the original author's intention in mind. And Ali and I were very lucky. And then Natalka said, look, you are the artist now, whatever you want to do. Well, we weren't going to take it that far, but she was very open to answering any questions. With Helena Kruk, we stayed. There were some phrases that were hard to translate, so we needed her help for that. But I think I also became profoundly interested in hearing how people talk about translation. And I know what people mean when they say that they are doing it to give voice to those who don't have a voice. But I feel that that's become for me a loaded statement, because that's almost like colonizing them,
Mm.
saying, you don't have a voice, I will give you a voice. The responsibilities, there are voices. I mean, and I know they're not, if people are dying, if there's no publishing, but the focus should be on not thinking that you're gifting somebody with something, but that you're actually working in service to show their voice. So there's something there. And I also had an interesting experience teaching where I read, as I often do, Carolyn Forché's wonderful The Colonel, and where she gets to the point where she says that, the colonel dropped the bag of ears on the floor and said, something for your poetry. And she says, they were like dried peaches. There is no other way to say it. And one student in class spoke up and said, no, there are other ways to say it. And that was such a profound moment. Yes, there are other ways. This is a simile,
And
but there are other ways to say it.
the West Side.
So it's those kind of moments that just, with full respect to all, that, kept me really thinking as I continue to translate.
I'm thinking about bridge building. When you translate, you're building a bridge between
Mhm.
one uh, consciousness and another. And here we are seeing bridges being blown up, between uh, countries and in this war. And Um, and I'm thinking, what can we save, or can we begin to hope that we can have a restoration or a rebirth? Uh, this paradise that's being bloodied up in the war. Um, we all seem to go through losing a paradise in our lives, whether we are
Yes.
Ukrainians or Tamils from Sri Lanka or wherever we come from. And so that seems to be a given. Uh, and then, but there's also the rebirth, this very powerful idea that the sun will rise even
Hmm.
on the killing fields, and that a flower will bloom out of
Yes.
that those bones. So, um, do you have a sort of a talking about the if you're a messenger or a prophet, what the larger message for your readers? Um, what would you tell us as we read your poems? And I think your poems are very they are very layered, and they are parables and they are
Mm-hmm.
abstract. They're paintings that we need to interpret. In other words, the images are not they're not spoon fed to the reader. Though the language is clear and intelligible, it, the images are, uh, it's like the Rush, forgive the conference, the Russian doll. You open one and then you see another and another. So there are layers. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I think I was haunted by some of your poems, haunted waking up in the middle of the night thinking, well, what does she mean exactly? And that desire it, and that's why I say that they're like paintings. You can sort of contemplate them, and with each view, different ideas come up. So it's a very rich experience reading you, and it's a rereading you that's key. So whoever picks up this book, those absences now closes, please give it a reread and another reread. You know, it's really a lovely book. So tell us about that experience of. Well, I've lost my way, but I wanted to ask you about also now about your strategies as a poet. I mean, do you come to the poem with a rhythm in your mind, and then the words come? Do you come with a line when you're writing the poem down, and then the second line sort of flows naturally from the first? Do you come with a strategy? You want to tell a story about a country that's being bombed, or you want to tell a story about a childhood that was shaped in a
Mm-hmm.
particular landscape in Ohio, and the story you're telling us in prose earlier, which appears in poems in this book.
Mm-hmm.
So is this going? I'm sorry, I'm a
No,
big
no, no.
question.
Um,
Go ahead.
I feel that the the stories that I heard a lot from my parents, first generation stories or what have you, that voice, that storytelling voice. In my previous book, Bad Harvest, the whole first section was prose poems. And I felt that the sense of story and the rhythm or imagining that narrative was so embedded in me that I could do it line to line to line and kind of retell that story. When it goes into terrain where things are a mystery for me, then I find that I'm led by an image that's strong. And I would just stream of consciousness, let everything pour out. And then visually, sometimes I will then couplet it, couplet it, couplet it, couplet it to see if there are transitions or if there are leaps or if there's, a dead passage, that would need to be removed. So I don't have a strategy. I do think that what I sometimes did to trick myself into um, feeling my way into a poem is that I would pick up poets who I love their work and I would read it out loud
Hmm.
and get into the body of that poem. and then halfway through slip in whatever I was working and begin to read it and see if it has a body to offer. So that helps me edit. And also, like, sometimes I will sort of blah blah, no, 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 like I'll hear the rhythms, I'll feel where the mood is going, where the pauses are going, but the words haven't quite found there. I wish I could say, you know, one thing works for me or not, but I do feel with storytelling that then it's easier for me to go to a prose poem and feel this is in the um, um, in the tradition of storytelling. Whereas, like with couplets, for example, my mother was a painter, not a famous one, but she painted constantly, and she always painted flowers, which I understand sometimes people who go through trauma have a tendency to focus on one thing, because she felt as long as she focused on that, she could block out other things. But it's very like impressionistic, and her flowers never touch the ground and they never have a vase. And I think that's kind of the same when I first started writing, that I
Mm.
felt that there was a painterly quality to it, but sometimes the vase was transparent, even to me, what held it
That's
together.
really beautiful, beautiful. A
You know,
painterly, what is in the vase, a transparent vase. That's a good title, The Transparent Vase. And yeah, um, I'm so glad you point out that you mentioned that your mother a painter, because you are a painter in these with words. I mean, in these phrases that you connect together, and but you don't. But you trust the reader to make the final connections. In other words, you don't spoon feed or direct too much, which is an art, the art of not directing, and yet letting the flower hang in the on the canvas, even and in that transparent vase, which you can't see, but you know it's there, holding the image in place. Would you read some more, a couple more poems, as you wish? We are in the concluding parts. I mean, we can talk
sure.
for a good amount of time, but you know how it is with
Yes, I know. So I'll read two, and then if I can read one, can
of
you
the
put me
trans.
in?
Yeah, that would be
Yes,
great. Lovely to hear.
we'll see. But anyway, so this one
Uh,
is called Break. Yes.
and I'm just curious. I mean, this is out of the blue, but the poems of yours that have been translated into Ukrainian, are any of those from this book? You,
Um,
I'm just curious.
No, the most
Okay,
recent one was from Bad Harvest, and then from earlier books, except for one obscene brushstroke, which was the title of one of my books. So I guess the painterly thing
it
was on
was there.
there.
It was always there.
Uh,
Go ahead. Yeah.
okay, breaking news. What breaks one person revives another. What breaks into silence breaks through to eternity. But what if heaven is bombed and clouds no longer diaphanous, split like dried earth, crumble into dust, mortal as family? What war? The soil is well drained through peonies whose only passion is to be unforgettable red. The hummingbird moth wishes for clover, the skin on your ankle for a blade of grass to sweep against it. What war? The sky has plenty of room. Petitions buzz like bees or lift into kites if you run fast enough, pull hard against the winds. 7 months in, no one reports the bombings anymore. What war? Silence. Imagine that. Imagine three birds at night calling out to their mates, I made it, I'm still here. In the meantime, a woman lies trapped under the rubble of a 9-story building. Everyone's praying she's still alive. Prayer is hope. But what is hope other than guesswork? And guesswork, the surefire way not to get to heaven. And then the second one I'll read, this is part of a sequence, is when the dial gets turned down on news reporting, I started thinking, oh my God, it's one thing if, hundreds of thousands of people die, but the question that I posed to Google was how many deaths must it take to be considered a war?
Yeah, that's a
And
very
Google had
powerful
an
question
answer,
too.
1,000 lives. So this is called war. Sorry, my dogs. But the first 100 are only fooling. They've saved their caboodles from drama class. Death makeup is a breeze. They clear their throats, step into the spotlight, center stage. A mother applauds. Outside moonlight carves its solid world. The second 100 are children again. They run through fields of daisies, fingers interlocked, index fingers pointing, rat-a-tat-tat, we're safe. Migrative imagination, pretend machine guns, execute a pact. The third 100 drag their feet, lost, heavy with song. Song is healthy for the soul, but who will listen? Fearful neighbors slam their doors shut. Surely you understand, they whisper. The fourth 100 never vacate their apartments. They're still there, lying quiet in their beds, their bodies packed with prayers. A concrete city block disintegrates between earth and air. The fifth 100 simply refuse to die until they find their daughter's favorite stuffed bear, the one with the black button, blind eyes that keeps her safe at night. The sixth 100 press their ears to a hollow wall. Who is shouting in the dark? Not everyone who hears voices is unwell. A plastic viewmaster, a last luxury to be held in their son's hands. The seventh 100 cry a creek, a stream, a river. The eighth 100 don't remember first words, don't hear last screams, their mouths open like that of a toddler gasping for air. A living heart, here. The ninth 100 believe they are still warm inside, the way a burning forest believes it's a perfect metaphor for the spiritual world, even after its ash. 999 are missing one who got away. Praise be.
God, what a poem! Yeah, what a series of poems, really. But both breaking news and war, these two kept. Uh, um, you really write poems from what you see and hear. The newest. There's a category of poetry. I don't know if it's a category, but I call it news poems, or in Spanish poemas noticieros. But that line about Marianne Moore, I think about that we die for what's not for the lack of what is when poetry is not there, we'll die for the lack of what is there and what the poetry gives. Um,
Mhm.
so this poetry is giving the real I mean, the real news in a sense, uh,
Mhm.
and it's breaking inside our hearts and our minds as we read it and listen.
And the fractured self, as you mentioned,
Yeah,
finding
is
some.
yeah. But ultimately, do you give us an affirming flame? At the end of the first reading of your book, or the second, or the third. I mean, we go on. At least I go on,
Mhm.
renewed somehow. Uh, I go on with learning also as a student of your poetry. This image after image, and this less is more, and not giving it all to the reader, asking the reader to contemplate and to think and to contemplate. So I think this is all very good and enriching. Um, Tell me again about this photograph. This goes back to what time period? Those are all your sisters, brothers, I
Yeah,
mean sisters,
I'm trying to remember the
friends.
exact year. Um, 1964.
Oh
Um,
my.
this is a woman, Nadia Fadoun, who immigrated um, from Germany and Ukraine. She was my mother's best friend. Um, she unfortunately took her life one
Mm.
year on Valentine's Day, but she was the closest to an aunt to my sister and I had growing up. Me, the weight of the world on my shoulders, even my sister and my mother.
And your mother.
My father took the picture, and that was in our uh, 10 acres. And
Amazing.
my father took a lot of pictures. He had a very lyrical eye, so I use photographs. This is my seventh book as much as I can.
Right, right.
From that.
And your mother, the painter. So you have the artistry runs in, comes, in the family as well from your mother, but and your father's eye, his
Yes.
photographic eye. What about writing? Are there writers in your?
There were, I mean, my sister writes beautifully, even though she hasn't chosen that, to be published or whatever, but in spirit and daily life. And um, my mother used to write little essays that she'd get published in the Ukrainian Svoboda, the local Ukrainian American papers. And my father did too. Um, they had also very good humor, which when I started writing, I loved irreverence. I loved humor. I loved the fact that my first identity to some of the Ukrainian clothing was that I thought it looked a lot like what Jimi Hendrix wore.
Hmm.
And that gave me new hope for my wardrobe because the Ukrainian thing blended in with the hippies and Woodstock and everything. So there was humor in that. And I hope to find my way. There are glimpses of humor in there, but I hope to find my way back to humor. And that's something that's very difficult because the world has always been fractured, but it's an important thing to remind yourself that is the way of surviving, is to continue those other emotions. And I had the pleasure of meeting Helena Kruk last fall, and somebody posed the question about the sudden interest in Ukrainian poetry, and she said it's wonderful, it's terrific, but all the attention is going to war poetry. Please, somebody read what we wrote before. Please, somebody be interested. And in this book, Helena Crook, she sent earlier poems as well. Everybody jumps on the war because that's the most
Right,
topical.
right, right,
Um, but she was saying like it's a growth that is abnormal. It's a sudden growth like a tree,
right,
but its
right.
limb it's growing too fast and it's going in the wrong direction. So Ali and I are actually translating a piece by a filmmaker that I already translated once, but this is going to be revised and improved to go back and not just get the poems that are the most sensational in terms of war imagery. But they are. I mean, the first poem that I was ever drawn to is a war poem that made me decide, yes, I want to translate. Thank you, Helena Kruk. And it just cuts to the heart. So that's necessary too. I don't say that it isn't, but that's the larger thing that I would hope for once a culture is recognized for something, it then is
It,
allowed to be recognized for
it's allowed to
larger
laugh
things.
again. It's allowed to cry in delight. And
Yes.
um, I can't resist. We're closing, but can't resist asking about Purple Rain. Then I mean, Purple Rain comes up. Hendrix comes up in this book, and then back in the USSR, which of course is the Beatles song. And I grew up listening to that song, but I never thought about these lines, the Ukrainian girls sing
Ah,
it.
yes.
Is there some darker, deeper meaning there that I need to be?
There definitely, I mean, for me, no, there's irony because we were so happy to knock somebody out for
Right,
some reason. And but with the Beatles, I'm blanking out here though. They were, you know, tongue in cheek, those not particularly Ukraine, but back in the USSR and what they were experiencing in their touring and what have you. And the Hendrix song, it wasn't Purple Rain. That's Prince.
oh, sorry, my
Are you
my
good? That's okay. Forgive. um, are you experienced? I remember when Hendrix, I mean, the Beatles and I Want to Hold Your Hand was one thing, but when we got the album for Hendrix, and my mother, bless her, took us to see Hendrix. I also saw the Beatles and I saw the Monkees, which
Oh,
counts, I suppose, less. But Hendrix, to see him on stage, to feel his energy in like preteen or early teen, and when then he says, "But are you experienced?" I thought, "Oh, hell no. And this is a shame." Because he asked it in such a way that if you weren't, shut up and go back to your room until you're ready to come out.
okay.
So that's just sort of dipping into that coming of age, which at this decade, I'm still coming of age. What age, I don't know, but I'm still coming of
That's a
age.
great point. We're still coming of age. There's a lot more to talk in this book, and I'm so glad that we to reflect on the coming of age, um, uh, and that war is not the only subject, and
Mhm.
we have a world to rescue and conserve, and a way of life to celebrate, and so the celebratory aspects of poetry. So I'm looking forward to reading your translations and your new work. Let us know what your next. Do you have a book planned in the works that will be coming out in the next
This
period?
book just came out this past fall, like 2 days after my daughter got married. So it's been very busy. And
Mm,
this came right after that. Dovzhenko's The Enchanted Desna, which is an autobiographical novella. And Desna is a river that runs through Ukraine and Russia. We hope that will come out next year with Lost Horse Press. And I'm probably 6 poems into a new manuscript. And so I'm very excited
great,
about that.
great.
And
Do you want 6 points of new manuscript, and then you have this memoir coming out from Lost House Press? Did you say?
it's not a memoir, it's
Oh,
a novella.
a novella. Okay.
Dovzhenko was a noted Soviet Ukrainian filmmaker, regarded one of the best, but he was also a literary stylist. So he wrote this beautiful, absolutely beautiful lyrical.
And it's your translation. Great.
Yeah.
We'll look out for this work. Thank you so much, Dzvinia. Would you like to close out with a reading a new
I
poem,
would love to read a poem by Helena Kruk, if
please?
I may, to honor her voice. And Helena Kruk is a Lviv-based poet, mid-career, being regarded as one of the most foremost beloved voices of Ukraine. So this poem, the only thing I'm going to say is that it references that Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote that in all of our souls there is a God-sized hole that we in life try to fill. And so she kind of thinks in the background, if you experience the loss of love, then the whole, that loss of love is the size of God. But I'll say no more. I'll read it in Ukrainian first, and then in English. I'm watching the time. Чорна діра. Любов залишає у серці жінки діру розміром з чоловіка. Спершу мріяти, потім міряти, применшувати, прибільшувати, не договорювати, триматися подалі від краю. Боже, не слухай жінку закохану, жінку розчаровану, жінку покинуту. Жодній з них не слухай. Вони самі не розуміють, чого просять. Любов залишає у серці жінки діру розміру з іншою жінкою, сяючу порожнечу лакуну, якої нічим не закласти, антиматерію, вибухову хвилю, молитву про помсту. Боже, не проходь мимо. Любов залишає у серці жінки діру розміром з Богом. Black hole. Love leaves a hole in a woman's heart the size of a man. Dream first, then measure, minimize, exaggerate, understate, stay far from the edge. God, don't listen to the woman in love, the disappointed woman, the abandoned woman. Don't listen to any of them. They themselves don't understand what they're asking. Love leaves a hole in the woman's heart the size of another woman, a gaping void, a lacuna that cannot be sealed. Antimatter, a blast wave, a prayer for revenge. God, don't walk on. Love leaves a hole in the woman's heart the size of God.
Thank you, Dzvinia. Thank you
With
so much for this time.
full hearts, thank you so much for this conversation,
Thank you.
Indran. It's a
Thank you.
pleasure.